So I'm honored to be here at its inception, and we will do our part. This is a great seminary. It's a great institution, one of the finest in the world. Those of you who are studying here realize that. I was here during the days of Gleason Archer and Walt Kaiser and Thomas McComiskey, at the same time that we had John Gerstner and Norm Geisler and John Warwick Montgomery, studied under the great privilege under Dr. John Woodbridge. I remember Norm Geisler once saying to me, "I had you here for 2 years, but you never opened your mouth even once. Why?" I said, "I was afraid you'd know I knew absolutely nothing. I'd come in absolutely green." And how this faculty shaped my burdens, my thinking. And, you cannot gainsay that. You cannot repay that kind of debt. And if there's a small role I can play in just coming alongside whatever doors we can open and they can open for us, along with our Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which is now an accredited institution through Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, I can see this incredible tandem relationship of exchanging faculties and giving the students to study on both sides of the waters, understanding worldviews. Let me just take 10, 12 minutes to say something and then leave it open for questions. We had a great session here this morning, and this an informal one for some of you to raise your questions. And it is this. When you look back upon the landscape of, say, the last 25 years or 30 years, there were voices sounding forth at that time of the changes that were coming. I remember listening to Everett Koop and Francis Schaeffer in the 1980s, sounding the alarm of what were being then seen as the moral underpinnings from which extensions would be made and decisions would be made. Who would have ever thought that you'd hear ethical theories that we now listen to from the voice of Peter Singer and others, not just liberal in their thinking, but radically so, at the end of a spectrum of thought where we not only do not know how to define human life, but we define it in ways that could actually be stunning and shocking. And once the shock value is gone, they become common ideas and carried into ramifications. We no longer can define what life is. We cannot define what sexuality is. We do not know how to define what marriage means. I remember when Chuck Colson had invited me and a few others to New York some months ago, from which emerged the Manhattan Declaration. I remember at the end of that day phoning my wife, and I said to her, I was in New York flying back to Atlanta that night, I said, I never dreamed of the day that you'll have a room full of men and women trying to define things like life, marriage, sexuality. Things that you thought would be self-evident or that would have some input of the sacred, now thoroughly desacralized and almost defying any kind of definition or any kind of parameters. But people like Schaeffer warned us of this. I remember reading Malcolm Muggeridge in the 1970s, and Muggeridge himself had been quite a robust hedonist in his days. And yet when he handed in his papers as the chaplain of Edinburgh University, he made a powerful statement when he handed in his resignation. He said, whatever else the future holds, it is not going to lie in sexual freedom and psychedelic fancies, said he. And so from my point of view, he said the death knell is being sounded right now. This from a man who had lived an indulgent life and later in his life came to find Christ and tell the university students that it was a wrong-headed direction in which the academy was actually moving. Now, voices like that were there. And now as we live in the high noon of that kind of celebrated reasoning, it is going to be up to you and to me to know how to respond, why to respond, where to respond, and to do so not merely for the winning of an argument, but for the communication of something greater, brighter, nobler, that has that enchantment of what life was intended to be like and may well be like. And that's why we are part of an institution such as this, to understand the times. I have just written down, for the lack of time, just 5 changes that I think have come in the last 25 to 30 years. The first is the popularization of the death of God, of the atheistic mindset. Now, we all see that visibly, But the second part of this is a very important comment. It is not just the popularization of the death of God that we have seen, but the willingness to live with its ramifications. Once upon a time, you could argue with a person and take them to the logical outworking and say, how would you like to be in this kind of a world? Now the mindset seems to be, if you say it and repeat it and say it in a triumphalistic note, that's all you need to do. Who would have ever thought that an entertainer on a night program could actually humor his way through the indelicacies of his own private life? Whatever else it ought to have done, it ought not to have been something to trivialize and make a joke out of. But that's it. You say it, you pronounce it, you celebrate it, and it's over. Can you imagine if I, as a preacher, were to admit to all those kinds of prevarications and then make a joke out of it and move on? I shudder to think of what would happen if the pulpit could do that. But they say hypocrisy is the charge that vice brings to virtue. The charge of hypocrisy is what vice brings to virtue. That deep in their own thinking, they know some things are wrong. At least hypocrisy is wrong. And it is wrong for those who preach noble truths and preach great ideas of what life is all about. And so I say to you that the popularization of the death of God, but the celebration of its ramifications, so a la Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Harris, they will just say cavalierly what in 1946 Huxley said almost covertly: I want this world not to have meaning because a meaningless world frees me to my own exploits of sexual and political freedom. So that was one line thrown into a big book. Now it is a case of the main course that is being said again and again. You and I have to respond to that kind of thinking. Number two, it is the third world's attack upon Western ideas with the pantheistic and postmodern underpinnings to it that has actually made the ideas that shape the West look juvenile and everything else that comes from abroad look very sophisticated. It's the way it has happened. Now, I have a question for people like that. Why did you come to the West? Why did you move in that direction? Because there were some moral assumptions that were the bequest of the Judeo-Christian framework. Even if you didn't want to give credit to the worldview that framed them, you liked what you saw in the outworking. Do you know the Chinese government has just commissioned scholars in China to write again the history of missions in China, because the leadership in China recognized that missions have not been given a good and a fair name? It was a professor from one of the leading universities who sat in my office some weeks ago and told my wife and me that they are commissioning this writing to give the due benefit of what missions had done over the last century, principally in two arenas, in education and health, well-being for the Chinese people. This is being recognized and offered up now, money being offered up there for research. If I look at my own country like India, you look at a man like Deepak Chopra, who will tell you in his writings that he went to a Christian school and studied there. I went to a Western school in Delhi, and the gift of health and care and education came from the Judeo-Christian worldview. It was William Carey, along with RZAM Mohan Roy, who fought to abolish the sati system, where the widow had to throw herself into the flames of the husband's funeral pyre because her life was considered of no value. Carey fought for the protection of the woman in that, and RZAM Mohan Roy, a great Indian leader, came alongside him. One of the leading newspapers in India is called The Statesman. That was founded by William Carey in order to give the Indians a voice in the days of the British. These things are gobbled up in history, and people don't even take note or remember that. Think of this statement. We take these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal, with inalienable rights for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me ask you this question. Do you know of any other religious worldview that would have framed that statement, other than the Judeo-Christian faith? Could naturalism have framed that statement? No. Nietzsche said equality is a lie concocted by the weaker of the human species. Because he said there is no such thing as equality. There are superior, there are inferior people. And that was the idea that Hitler ultimately took to bring triumph of one group over the other. But the Christian faith so clearly says we're all created equal. And that gift of liberty is ultimately the gift of God, not something just bequested by a state or culture or whatever. But now all of a sudden, you can be in any public talk show, and it seems as though the most unwanted voice is that of the Christian. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I did an open forum at Hong Kong University a few weeks ago, and a young Western gal stood up and said, I don't understand why you think there is such a difference at all. She said, I've read the Quran and I've read the Bible. They're both saying the same thing. It's in a public forum. We must understand what these worldviews are saying, and with respect, draw the distinction, draw the clarity of the gospel. There are ideas in the gospel that are not present anywhere else. Take, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, profound piece of writing of the Hindu scriptures, much more popular than the Vedas. And in that, Krishna calls for the Prajapati, the sacrifice. The words of Krishna, they're calling for the sacrifice, but there's no sacrifice offered in there. Calling for forgiveness, but there's no forgiveness in the reincarnational system, is there? You pay and you pay and you pay and you pay. And how gently the gospel can be presented. I have a friend sitting here who comes from a Hindu background. He's a businessman in Atlanta. For nearly 1 year, weekend after weekend, we chatted and chatted and chatted. And finally, when it dawned on him on the beauty of the gospel, in our living room, he bowed his head and prayed. Until this very day, the most glorious thing he'll talk about is about the cross and what forgiveness really means. It's a beautiful truth. And yet the world out there doesn't realize how precious it is. When you've gone wrong, you look for forgiveness. How marvelous to know the cross has provided it. But this disorienting hit from pantheistic worldviews. Number 3 is the power to inform through the visual. We now take truth through the eye gate, not through reason. And so it comes through the back door of the imagination. Where I think it was William Blake who said, this life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. We are intended to see through the eye with the conscience. Most people today see with the eye devoid of a conscience. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. So we've got a visually conditioned culture. I'm not much of a moviegoer, but people plead and beg me to see some of them so that we can respond to them. So I was cajoled and pled with and written from different parts of the world to please go and see Avatar. I wanted to say we already had 330 million of them. Why one more? But I did. Brilliant, isn't it? Brilliant in cinematography. And now English movies are just beginning to resemble Hindi movies. That's all it is. The melodrama of it. That's all. Bollywood was 30 years ahead of this kind of stuff. And 30 years ago, we'd sit and laugh at it. Now it is so engaging, you know. Isn't it interesting? A Hollywood technocrat who sees the military as a culprit for destroying lives has never bothered to ask how many souls and consciences Hollywood has destroyed. Think about it. How many lives has it destroyed with its means? Oh, but you can't go there. The well-known actor William Hurt had breakfast with me one morning in Thailand, and he's no lover of the Christian faith or whatever, quite a secular-minded man, but really we had a very personal chat. He said to me, he produced a film. He was en route to Hong Kong. And Hollywood had rejected it in one line. They could not accept it because there was no violence in it. I said, are you summarizing what they said? Extrapolate? He said, no, that's the one line. They don't want it because there's no violence in it. I wonder if he told the producer of Avatar that. They didn't want it because there's no violence in it. That's what entertains. It's all coming through here, and we don't bother to think this through And we've got a generation raised with the visual that has never cerebrally addressed these issues of systemic contradiction. And lastly, I say this, it has become a youth-oriented world as a cultural molding point, which means the young ought to really be an audience to whom we speak and how we speak to them. The question is this: how do you reach a generation that thinks with its eyes, or listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? That's the challenge. I give you just 3 simple responses and then we'll take questions. Number 1, we are going to need an apologetic that is not merely heard but is also seen. The apologetic will have to be seen. If the Christian life is not seen, it'll become nothing more than theoretical. Just 4 days ago in Washington, a young Indian woman, very successful, of a young family, a mother of 2, I think, immensely successful, came to me up to the front and said, "Can I talk to you?" And I was surrounded by people, so I couldn't. But as I said, I'll call you on my way to the airport. And literally, while my colleague is taking my bags, I get on the phone and she phones me, a very well-to-do family. And I had the privilege of seeing her come to Christ right on the phone as I'm walking to the gate. And you know what she said to me? She said, "The reason I'm talking to you is because in some of the greatest struggles our family has had, it has been the Christians who've been there to help me and help me find my way through these dark nights of the soul," as you called it. What a tribute to the Christians who have sown the seed and done all of the groundwork, and then I have the privilege of just praying. And you didn't even have to pluck the fruit, you just had to keep your hand there. It was ready to fall into the hand. And so the life has to be lived. And when the life is lived, never underestimate the impact of what it is going to do. Seen, not just heard. Number 2, an apologetic that is not merely argued, but that is also felt. You cannot have a persuasive preacher if the preacher himself or herself is not coming through as being persuaded. That internal engagement of the emotion, that internal engagement of your personality, woe be to me if I preach not the gospel. That passion that is so real. It is fascinating to me when I go to the Middle East how intensely passionate the people are. They expend more energy in saying good morning than you and I would oftentimes in a whole message. The passions are very real, and therefore the passion for the gospel will also have to be real if it is to appeal to a generation that lives so much with its feelings and so much with the pathos and so much with the reality of the felt word. So I say it is to be heard. It is not merely to be heard but seen, not merely argued but also to be felt. And lastly, it is an approach that rescues not only the ends of bringing them to the knowledge of Christ, but the means where we do not compromise the word in process. It's a very important point. You cannot compromise the word in the process of bringing them over to the experience of Christ. It is very easy to do that and very difficult not to do it. That means, how do you reach a world where that which is seen and that which is real is identical? You will have to bring that life in the proclamation of the word, where what is read and heard is identical to what is with life itself. The Bible doesn't say in the beginning was video. It says in the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word. I have often thought, why didn't Christ wait to be incarnated till we had the video camera? It would make so much sense. The Sermon on the Mount and Lazarus. If you had all the video cameras showing all that stuff, my goodness. But when the rich man finds himself asking God why he could not go back to tell his brothers, God said to him, they already have Moses and the prophets. And if they do not believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if somebody comes back from the dead. The word has a lasting, abiding value as a carrier of truth. It has an abiding, lasting value as a carrier of truth. I don't know how many times I've been on a mission where I've been terrified to go in front of the audience, and one verse leaps out at you and brings the lion out inside of you. It is not just a memory, not just a picture, but that word. Your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you. And it is that word that cannot be broken. And it is that word that is held in high esteem here. There are many theological institutions where the word is not honored. Religion is, ideas are, but the word is relegated to something archaic and passé. And yet it is the word that Christ has given to you and to me. And from that, I make this extension. You know, I remember some time ago telling people, I was speaking at a bar association, and many years had gone by about this story. And I was at the North Carolina Bar Association, and the head of the bar association, she was sitting next to me and said, "You must be a very brave man." I said, "Why?" She said, "You've come to people who deal with words. They're able to argue themselves out of any situation." I said, "So you're telling me I should be nervous?" She said, "Well, this is a tough audience." I said, "I understand." I said, "I understand, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to, but I'll do my best." And they sat there after lunch. It was this kind of a look, you know. And I began by saying, I said, "You know, before I came here, something fascinating happened." I said, the first 3 items on the news on CNN were this. Number one, this was during the days where a famous statement was made, "It all depends on what the word is means." Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And so, as we do in this culture, in a salvation by survey culture by which we live, you want to find answers to anything, survey people. So the news cameraman was walking around, and the first question on his survey was, "Do words mean anything? Do words mean anything? Or does the speaker reserve the right to fuse every word or any word with their own meaning?" And after the survey, the answer was, no, words don't actually have an objective meaning. It is the speaker that fuses meaning into the words, and that's what words really are. We speak and we decide what meaning fits into them, so that was the answer. The second question was, does morality have any point of reference? And the answer was no, each person chooses their own morality. So words had no referent, morality had no referent. You know what the third item on the news was? I said, ladies and gentlemen, the third item on the news was a warning sent to Saddam Hussein that we'll start bombing him if he doesn't stop playing his word games. The arms just dropped. I said, so if you are a peddler of words and your words don't have objective meaning and objective value, you are manufacturing a world of your own. And when worlds collide of that nature, the impact is of cataclysmic proportions. Was it Thomas Becket, the man for all seasons, when he is told to renounce his words or whatever? Trying to see if I can get this story here straight. And not Thomas Becket. Who am I thinking of? Thomas More, good for you. Thomas More. Actually, you know what? It's one of my relatives that wrote the book. He lives in Cambridge now, an Englishman, married to one of my distant cousins. In India, we're all related. And so we just lay credit to whatever we can. So he's in prison, and his daughter comes to him and says, "Why don't you just say the words? Say the words in favor of the king and you'll be released." And he says, "Meg, no." He says, when you give your word to somebody, you hold your life in your hands. And he said, if you should open that hand and drop your word, you shall look down and you shall never find yourself again. When you give your word to somebody, you hold your life in your hands. If you open your hands and let it drop, you shall look down and never find yourself again. Your word and my word to society will have to be consistent with what we preach. And the word that he has given to us is what we must carry within our proclamation, because that word is truth, and that word cannot be broken. So it must be seen, not just heard, must be felt, not just argued, but rescue not only the ends, but the means as well, so that the word is preserved and protected. So I'll leave that with you for openers here, and if there are any tough questions, my colleague John Jaroge will answer. All the easier ones I'll be glad to take. Thanks so much for giving me your attention. Yeah.